I almost didn't go. That's the part I have to live with, that I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 11 minutes, engine running, telling myself it wasn't my place, that it had been 2 years, that she probably didn't even remember my name. I went because my daughter asked me to. She'd read about the hearing in the local paper, a small item buried in the regional section. State board to consider license revocation for trauma nurse in wrongful death complaint. No photograph. Just the name, Carver M., and the date. My daughter had clipped it out and left it on the kitchen table with a sticky note that said, "Dad, isn't this her?" It was. I pushed through the glass doors of the Regional Licensing Administration building. At 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. The lobby smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. A security officer directed me down a long hallway to hearing room 4, a space about the size of a classroom. Drop ceiling, fluorescent panels, 2 long tables facing a raised dais where 3 board members were already seated and shuffling papers. The gallery was a dozen plastic chairs along the back wall. I took one near the end. She was already seated at the respondent's table. Her back was to me, but I recognized the set of her shoulders, straight and still, the way a person sits when they have learned to be very quiet in rooms that want to see them flinch. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt. Her hair was pulled back. She had a notepad in front of her that she wasn't writing on. The hospital's attorney was a thick-necked man named Garrett, according to the placard on his table. He had a stack of folders and the practiced ease of someone who did this often and expected it to go his way. He had already exchanged a few quiet words with the board chair, a trim woman in her 50s named Halverson, who had the bearing of a judge who had made her decision before sitting down. I am not a lawyer. I am not a doctor. I am a commercial heating and ventilation technician from a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest. And 2 years ago, I was lying in a trauma bay with a collapsed lung and a femur fractured in 2 places. And the woman at that respondent's table was the reason I walked out of that hospital. I should tell you what I know about her, not what Garrett was about to say, what I know. Halverson gavelled the session open at precisely 9 o'clock. She read the case number, the complaint, the standard language about the board's authority over licensed medical practitioners in the state. Then she set the paper down and looked at Garrett with an expression that was not quite a nod, but close enough. Garrett stood and established his thesis in the first 30 seconds. A patient had died in Nurse Carver's care following an automobile collision. Blunt abdominal trauma, spinal involvement, internal hemorrhage. The family's position, supported by the hospital's risk assessment, was that the triage decision Nurse Carver made to classify the patient as expectant, meaning unlikely to survive with available resources, had been premature, reckless, and unsupported by proper protocol. The patient had been 22 years old. The family had loved him. Nurse Carver had marked him for non-intervention, and he had died on a cot in a side room. Garrett let that sit for a moment. Then he said that this was not the first time questions had been raised about Nurse Carver's judgment. There was a pattern, he said. A willingness to make extreme unilateral decisions, a disregard for procedural checks. He used the phrase incompetent and dangerous. He used it twice. Halverson wrote something on her notepad. I watched Nurse Carver's back. She did not move. I had been in that trauma bay on a Tuesday evening in November. I had come in by ambulance after a delivery truck ran a red light and hit my car at the driver's door. I was conscious when they brought me in. Barely. I remember the noise, the monitors, the voices calling numbers back and forth, and I remember her face leaning over me. Young, focused in a way that was not hurried, which I found strange given the circumstances. She told me her name. She told me what she was going to do and why. She said, "You have a hemethorax on your right side, and I need to decompress it now, and I need you to hold still." Her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. She inserted a needle into my chest wall, in a space between my ribs, and the pressure that had been crushing me from the inside released in one long breath. I heard the air go. She watched the monitor, called out a number, and then moved on to the next problem with the same unhurried precision as if she had been here before. As if all of this, the blood pressure dropping, the jagged lines on the screen, the orderly calling for a unit, was a language she had spoken for years in a worse place than this. I found out later, from a nurse's aide who talked too freely, that the trauma attending on that shift had taken one look at my vitals and called it unlikely. Nurse Carver had disagreed. She had not raised her voice. She had simply continued working. I walked out of that hospital 9 days later. Garrett had been speaking for 20 minutes when the door at the back of the hearing room opened. He did not stop talking right away. He finished his sentence, something about protocol compliance records, and then he did stop, because Halverson had looked up from her notepad, and the look on her face was the kind that stops a room. The man who had come through the door was in uniform, not a hospital security guard, not a local officer. Full-dress uniform, Air Force. Class A blues, the brass on his collar catching the fluorescent light. He was carrying a slim briefcase and a manila envelope that was sealed across the top with a strip of red tape. He was a colonel, based on the insignia, and he walked to the front of the room with the deliberate economy of someone who had decided exactly how this was going to go before he arrived. He addressed Halverson. He said his name, Colonel Adair, Judge Advocate General's Corps, Regional Command, and he said that he was there to submit materials relevant to the case before the board, pursuant to a request filed 72 hours earlier under federal disclosure rules. He placed the envelope on the edge of the dais. Halverson said that this was an administrative hearing, not a federal proceeding, and that she would need to understand the basis for the submission. Colonel Adair said, "The basis is that the practitioner whose license you are considering revoking holds a classification that is directly relevant to the board's assessment of her competence and her judgment. He said it the way you say something you have said to people like her before." Halverson told him to proceed. He broke the red seal on the envelope. He removed a document, a thick one, with a cover sheet bearing a classification marker, and he set it on the table in front of him. He did not look at Garrett. He looked at Halverson, and he began to read. "The name of the operation is the kind that has no meaning to a civilian, a string of 2 words that could have been anything. But the date was real, and the location, described in general terms as a ridgeline above 8,000 feet in a hostile theater, was real. And what Colonel Adair read next was very real. He read that on the specified date, a combat pararescue specialist attached to a forward element had held an improvised aid station on that ridgeline for 11 hours following a downed aircraft and a subsequent engagement. He read that she had rendered care under direct fire. He read that she had performed 4 separate surgical interventions with field equipment, including a needle thoracostomy and a tourniquet application to a partially amputated limb, that the unit's flight surgeon would later describe as textbook under any conditions, let alone those. He read that she had carried 2 men down from the ridgeline herself over multiple trips after the rest of her element was unable to. He read that 6 personnel were alive because of what she had done on that mountain. He paused. He read the name of the decoration she had been awarded, the Air Force Cross, the second highest honor the service gives. The room was completely quiet. The fluorescent panels hummed. Halverson's pen was on the table. She was not writing. Colonel Adair turned the page. He said that inside the file was a handwritten operational note submitted by her team leader, who had been one of the 2 men she carried down. He said the team leader was not present, but that 2 members of her former unit were in the gallery. And he indicated with a slight turn of his head. 2 men in the chairs to my left had risen to their feet. They were not in uniform. They were wearing civilian clothes, but they were standing the ways men stand when they are called to account for something. Straight, deliberate, making themselves known. One of them was maybe 30, with the kind of build that does not come from a gym. The other was older, a scar running along his jaw. Neither of them said anything. They were simply standing. At the respondent's table, Nurse Carver, the woman Garrett had spent half an hour calling a liability, a risk, a pattern, had turned in her chair. She was looking at the 2 men in the gallery. Something crossed her face that she controlled almost immediately. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, something quieter than either of those. She put her hand flat on the table and pressed it there once, lightly, and looked away. Colonel Adair addressed the board. He said that the triage decision the board was here to review, the classification of a traumatic injury as non-survivable under available field and hospital resources, was consistent with the doctrine her unit had practiced, refined, and relied upon in conditions under which a wrong call meant multiple deaths, not one. He said that what Garrett was calling reckless, the Air Force Cross citation called sound judgment under pressure. He said those were not the same thing. Garrett said respectfully that civilian medical standards were not military field standards, and that the board's jurisdiction. Halverson stopped him. She stopped him with 2 words, and a look that made him set his pen down. Then she looked at Nurse Carver for what might have been the first time since the hearing began, and the look on her face was not the one she'd worn when Garrett was building his case. I cannot tell you exactly what it was. I can tell you it was different. The hearing did not end immediately. There were procedures. Halverson recessed to confer with the other 2 board members for 22 minutes. Garrett sat very still at his table. Nurse Carver sat very still at hers. The 2 men from the gallery had taken their seats again. though both of them were leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, watching the dais. When Halverson returned, she read a short statement. The board had found insufficient grounds to support the revocation petition. The complaint would be entered into the record, but would not result in disciplinary action. Nurse Carver's license would remain intact. She said it in the flat procedural language of a board chair doing her job, and I understood that was how it was supposed to sound. But she paused for just a moment at the end, after the gavel, and she looked again at Nurse Carver with that different look, and she did not say anything else. Garrett gathered his folders. He did not look at anyone. In the corridor outside, I waited near the water fountain. I didn't know what I was going to say. The two men from the gallery came out first, and stopped on either side of the door like they had done that before, too. Colonel Adair came out with his briefcase, exchanged a few words with the older of the two men, and moved on down the hall. Nurse Carver came out last. She saw me and stopped. She looked at me for a moment the way you look at something you placed in a drawer a long time ago and had not expected to find again. Then she said my name. She did remember I was wrong about that, and she asked me how I was doing. I told her I was well. I told her my femur had healed clean. I told her my daughter had been the one who saw the notice in the paper. She said, "Tell her thank you." I told her what I had been sitting on for 2 years, in 11 minutes in a parking garage, and in 19 months before that. I told her that I had not known what she was when she had worked on me. I had not known about the mountain or the 11 hours or what an Air Force cross cost a person to earn. I had just been a man on a table in a bad way, and she had been steady, and that steadiness had not come from nowhere. I told her I understood that now. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "It came from the same place yours did. It came from not having another option." I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about that for a long time, about what it means to be seen as dangerous for the thing that saves someone, about how much ground a person can hold before anybody thinks to look at what she is standing on. My daughter asked me how it went. I told her it went the way it should have. I told her the right thing happened eventually. She asked if that was enough. I thought about the two men standing in that gallery without being asked, and Colonel Adair breaking a red seal in a room that had already made up its mind, and Halverson's pen lying flat on the notepad. I told her, today it was.